The Lord be with you. Our reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Every year, the parents of Jesus went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended and they started to return, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. Then they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." He said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart, and Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in favor with God and human beings. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. So today is the Feast of the Holy Family, and we know that this is not simply an occasion to show our devotion to Joseph, Mary, Jesus as a family, but we realize, and indeed it's in our opening prayer, that this is the model for us. It's the model of human family. So it's a celebration of family that we have today, and it comes at a time of year we strongly associate with family, Christmas. Indeed, there's a great deal of comment that this is one of the last vestiges of family culture, is the celebration of Christmas. It's a sense that things getting, lost and slipping away. And so there's a tremendous adherence to some kind of Christmas tradition, even within the secular culture. The sense, something here is of value that we must cling to, essential to our identity, our community. So when we ask the question, why celebrate this, is it just because we've mentioned Mary and Joseph in the story? So, let's pause and give them a bit of the spotlight. But we do have to acknowledge that in the gospel texts, Jesus' family life occupies very little of the gospel writer's attention. There's very little of it in Mark. In John's gospel, you don't see his childhood at all, but you just see his adult relationship, mostly with his mother, and that's quite illuminating, but there's no sense of, where he's come from in that family life, how that's developed. And indeed, you don't even have Joseph figuring in any of those stories. And one can imagine that the writers, having to create gospels that focused on the essentials of Jesus' life. Remember, the gospels originally were evangelical documents in the fullest sense. They were meant to get the good news out there as quickly as possible and give us complete sort of a digest of who Jesus is to the world so that people might know him and be brought to him. So they're focused on the essentials, which tended to be what the church commemorated from its very outset, the events we celebrate in Holy Week and at Easter. But then, we find in Luke and Matthew stories of his childhood, of course, the birth narratives. Now, do you think of these as some kind of afterthought? Well, no, I don't think so. Now, each of the evangelists, they have their take on the gospel narrative, and each have particular emphases. And clearly what two gospel writers didn't pay much attention to, the other two regarded as more than worthy of comment. And if you're attentive to the stories that you find in Matthew and Luke, I think one can't help but be struck by how absolutely central family is to the story of human salvation. It's not a story of individuals who sort of drop in and out of history, unaccounted for, mysteriously emerging from the desert. But rather, much attention is given to, for example, in both those Gospels, laying out Jesus' family lineage, his human ancestry. In the story of Luke, we have two families that figure very prominently, two couples. Famously, Zechariah and Elizabeth, the aged couple who had been sort of consigned or resigned to the fact that they would have no children. And then suddenly here's John the Baptist, miraculously. And then, of course, we have Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, who we celebrate today. And the success of God's plan depended on the faithfulness and confidence in God of men and women joined in marriage to bring to fruition God's plan. That relied upon the aged Zechariah and Elizabeth, described in the scriptures as righteous. That Joseph was a necessary player in this great drama and was also accounted righteous and good. And of course, we know Mary, filled with grace. You know, the church has historically been pretty passive in its attitude toward family. For centuries, its keen interest in the stories of Jesus' birth they were more out of regard for Mary. And I think some of you may know that Joseph was never mentioned in the Eucharistic prayers of the church until the latest missal that we now use today. You know, so you had Mary and the saints and the martyrs all got mentions for almost 2 millennia of church prayer and celebration of the Mass, but Joseph was overlooked through all that time. But I think it's modernity's assault on the family as a central and integral human institution, as something that's been going on since, well, you can probably trace it right back to the beginnings of industrialization, because that transformation in the way we do work and organize our economy was so disruptive to family traditions. And the attacks have only accelerated in recent decades. You know, you think about the sexual revolution of the 60s that carries on right up today, always roiling and changing the nature of our relationships, at least arguing that the essentials are not what we think they are. And then you have radical feminism, which wishes to completely redefine the role of a woman, indeed the very nature of a woman, away from family, and so on. So the church's growing interest in the Holy Family has been largely a reaction to this. And in turning to the Gospels, we now find ourselves wishing we had a little more material. But then, as inspired text, I think we have to have faith that what we have is enough. And when we look at today's story of Jesus lost and then found in the temple, we have a principle of family life that has been given up by far too many today. And I'd say that passivity of the institutional church historically has now migrated out into Catholic families with disastrous results. So I don't know if you caught it, but at the very outset of the gospel passage today, we hear something about the traditions kept by the household of Joseph of Nazareth. And what we hear is that every year, the family made the journey to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. Now, you might assume that they would do this as it's a requirement of the Jewish law, of the Torah. But we know from archaeological records, the physical evidence that we can see, a lot of Jews in the first century simply didn't go. For those living abroad, obviously throughout the Roman Empire, it was impractical. But even those living in some proximity to the temple, the realities of the fractured state of Israel, broken up into those little statelets that I've mentioned before, and just the greater poverty experienced in the first century in that community in comparison to, say, the glory days of Solomon, made it harder for families to up and go for the Passover, let alone the other two feasts of the Torah that also required this pilgrimage. So some went, many didn't. And it's interesting to note that Joseph did and brought his family with him. Now, you need to know that the Galilee is some distance away. And like the vast majority of the population, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, they got around by walking. And so they had to walk the distance to Jerusalem. That's roughly, at a pretty good clip, a 2 days walk. The distance is around 190 kilometers one way, a round trip of something just shy of 400 kilometers. When's the last time any of us walked 400 kilometers over a weekend? But the family would do this. They would incur the expense of accommodation and food while away, not inexpensive. They'd have to forego the income that would be gone while Joseph was off with his family, and he didn't get vacation pay. So what we're seeing is a real commitment to rooting the family in the traditions of the faith and doing so at significant cost. That is, the Holy Family sacrificed to participate in the Passover. The church teaches that indeed that is what we all ought to be doing as a family, keeping the traditions, worshiping together, with parents taking charge of the religious formation of their children and leading their little ones by example. Our faith is not fed solely by the local parish church, the priest, and the community's worship. Indeed, one could almost say these are supplements, but for the singular importance of regularly receiving the Blessed Sacrament. Because it is in the home, what the Second Vatican Council called the domestic church, where faith is really nurtured or neglected, where it flowers or it withers. It is in the home, ideally with the graces of sacramental marriage flowing between husband and wife, and then to the children they may have, where there is a real possibility of sanctification. Family can make you holy. That should be no surprise. Our catechism devotes a whole section of its text to the centrality of family, both to church and human society. We must understand our families as little churches. As St. John Paul II preached in his apostolic exhortation, Familiaris Consortio, the Christian family constitutes a specific revelation and realization of ecclesial communion. And for this reason, too, it can and should be called the domestic church. All members of the family, each according to his or her own gift, have the grace and responsibility of building day by day the communion of persons, making the family a school of deeper humanity. This happens where there is care and love for the little ones, the sick, the aged, where there is mutual service every day, when there is a sharing of goods, of joys, and of sorrows. I can't say, as I remember well, what my expectations of my marriage and my family life were at the time of my, frankly, overdue proposal to Basilica, or when we exchanged our vows. But I do know that I'm almost continually surprised by how I have grown conscious of the fact that through our relationship within the sacrament of marriage, I experience holiness. And I find that my wife is a source of sanctifying grace, whether she knows it or not. And I lean a lot on my patron Saint Joseph, who teaches men to own their vocation as father, husband, protector, and provider, and then trust that God will guide them in their duties. And I know that too often I have been negligent and too often assumed that someone else was going to look after this task of forming my household in holiness. The institution of the church, the Catholic schools to which my daughter went. These only can work with what they are provided. We can't arrive at Mass or in the Catholic school classroom as blank slates and expect a whole lot to come of that. It's amazing how few families make it to Mass with it only being a few minutes' drive away. And I have personally heard these stories from missionaries, from visitors from the Church Universal who talk about Catholic families in places like, the Congo, rural regions of South America and Southeast Asia, who every Sunday walk 5, 6, or even 10 kilometers to attend the Mass. We're going to be facing many challenges when we emerge from our current situation. It was observed at our Christmas Eve 4 o'clock service that just passed, which is usually characterized by, frankly, bedlam for all the children swarming in the aisles, that it was very quiet. Even given the fact of capacity limits, we saw few families with children. Now, I know there are many considerations that have gone into decisions to come to church as of late. I entirely understand them, but I can't help but note the composition of the congregation. Those who trust in God's providential care to make coming to church worth it. And I think that's what we need to share with people. That far from it being a matter of church buildings and clergy, this is a matter of faith that lives within us. The sense that it is in our kitchens, living rooms, backyards, where we truly host Emmanuel, God with us. And then in welcoming him there, we joyfully make the sacrifices to celebrate our faith with others, to make the pilgrimages great and small, the trek of 2 or 3 days, the drive of 10 minutes, to go looking for Christ in his Father's house, and then be sure that he returns with us to our homes.